I'm a busy guy with a lot on the go, but I always make time to learn new things, which is why I am so thrilled to be working with the sponsor of today's video, a rising star in the streaming world, Magellan TV. Not only is Magellan TV the highest rated documentary streaming app on Google Play, but it offers the best value of any premium documentary streaming service for both its price and especially its quality. And the reason is that Magellan TV is all about the drama of real life. The lives of ancient pharaohs, critical battles in World War I and II, soldiers who fought in the Civil War, the battles for control of the British Crown, the Norman Conquest. Join us in watching the Saturn story and learn about the American program to put a man on the moon. Magellan TV has the largest and best collection of history shows anywhere, and since Magellan TV has membership gift cards available, they make the perfect gift as we get closer to the holiday season. I know my Secret Santa gift for the office party is sorted out. Not only are there no ads ever, but your subscription always includes 4K. Click the link in the description and join us today.
Hi, David.
Norland, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So this is another episode where we're going to talk about...
Ukraine?
Yeah, surprisingly. I think I will keep talking about it for a long time. Right now, Ukrainian forces is counterattacking Kherson, and there's lots of talks, conversation, focus around Kherson. Why Kherson is so important for Ukraine?
Look at a map. It's where it sits. Again, like we've talked about this, I think, in previous conversations like this. The Crimean access into the Black Sea, not necessarily the Crimea. I think Crimea comes next at some point, but making sure that the Ukrainians have open access into the Black Sea for grain transport. That's something that's a recent sort of development that's happened, is that Russia's decided that they're going to suspend open grain transports, largely as a result of the drone attacks, underwater naval drone attacks on Sevastopol, but we might talk about that in a minute. But making sure that they can liberate Kherson and open up river access, that they shut down egress points on the south, along the south shore, along the Black Sea. It's the next step towards making sure that Ukrainian forces can continue to move and operate further east. It's a logistics hub, transit points across the river at that point, as they continue to move east, liberating Ukrainian territory that's been controlled by the Russians since February.
And from the looks of it, Russia is going to defend Kherson fiercely, because they evacuated, I think, about 70,000 people from Kherson. They are threatening to blow up the dam there, Novakhovka Dam. So they won't flood everything, so the Ukrainians cannot cross the Dnieper. And we see that lots of mobilized guys are around Kherson. So do you think, and we saw the report from United States, where they say that Ukraine can take Kherson in 6 weeks. And I think the general consensus is that until the end of November, it's possible that Ukraine will take Kherson. So do you think Russia will be able to hold Kherson?
Long term, no. I mean, urban, as I think most of us are probably familiar, urban warfare is some of the most difficult, brutal fighting that can possibly happen. It's obviously incredibly different from maneuver, like being able to operate and maneuver on open ground. Urban fighting, it's close in, it tends to be incredibly bloody. I can't imagine that the Russians would make it any easier. There's lots of experience in terms of urban warfare and urban fighting between, Stalingrad always ends up being sort of this key example, but far more recently than that, you've got operations in Syria, in Chechnya, where there's been lots of urban fighting. The Russians have a very developed, albeit brutal, playbook that they can now fall back on. Personally, I think the Ukrainians will retake Kherson, but I will be very surprised if they do it through a direct assault. I think there's going to be a lot more encirclement and cut off of supplies. We all know that the Russians have had fairly significant logistics issues. Cutting off supplies into Kherson will increase, obviously, the attrition rate against the Russian forces there. But given that a lot of the conscripts, the mobilized forces that are in there, they're being forced to be there. the surrender rate amongst a lot of those troops would actually be quite high once supplies really are cut off, once they run out of things that they were forced to bring from home. That's going to be the reality of it. So that 6-week time frame, if it was a direct frontal assault, I would put the time frame at significantly longer. 6 weeks to take Kherson, I can see that based on attempts at encirclement and cutoff of logistics. I think it's possible. Lots of people talking about winter operations, winter offensive, things are going to shut down, go to winter quarters. I mean, this isn't fighting against Sweden in 1752. I mean, there isn't that anymore. Winter operations are completely viable and completely doable. There's probably about a 3 to 4 week period when the rains really start in, where the mud will bog things down a lot, but then things freeze over. And winter operations for those who have the supplies and the equipment, 1.5 missing Russian winter coats. I mean, that's where this becomes a really big deal. Winter operations are completely viable, and I think the Ukrainians know that and they're going to be prepared for that. The Russians are going to know that that's coming, but how prepared they're going to be, I don't know. So,
speaking of mobilization and conscripts, we see that lots of conscripts and mobilized troops gathering in Belarus, right? So there are two thoughts here. Like some people think that Belarus may join the war because Russia really, really needs additional forces, military personnel, professional military guys, rather than conscript people who never held a weapon in their hand. And the second thought is that mobilized guys need to undergo some kind of military training, and because there is no enough facility to facilitate these guys for the training. So what do you think? Is it possible that Belarus will join the war?
I think possibility versus probability. Possible, yes. Probable, very, very unlikely. The Belarusian military is at best suited for maintaining internal order, as opposed to prosecuting an actual war. I can't see Belarus joining in the war in some sort of an offense, in any kind of engage in any kind of offensive operations. They're not equipped, trained, professional enough, in my opinion, to do that. We would, if there was genuinely a thought that the Belarusian military was going to be joining in the war, we would see transference of troops, like UAF troops, moving onto the northern border. The proximity from Kyiv to the Belarusian border is quite close. If there was a real risk, I think we would be seeing some of that. Obviously the Ukrainian and Western intelligence networks are incredibly well developed and really good. I think we'd be seeing that. We're not. The training aspect, absolutely. I think that's a much more likely and a much more realistic possibility of what's going on there. One of the results of manpower shortage that the Russian army has undergone is that all their NCOs and training staff, etc., all have basically been engaged in fighting and are either engaged in fighting or they're dead. Or casualties at the very least, and not able to train new troops. So you need to find, basically, I think the Russian Armed Forces has outsourced its training to the nearest sock puppet government that they can, and that's Lukashenko. So I think that's very much my thought process in terms of why we're seeing those troops increase in Belarus. I can't imagine that the Belarusian government even wants to get themselves involved, knowing that the position that they're in, it's quite a small military to begin with. So I can't see any kind of offensive operations beginning from Belarus, just because I think Lukashenko himself knows the position that he'd be in if they were to directly engage.
We see something that we haven't seen before in the Russian government among the people who have influence. They start to blaming and the finger pointing at each other, especially Kadyrov and Prigozhin. Prigozhin is the founder and the head of the Wagner ЧВК, the private military. I don't know how that's possible, but yeah, within Russia there is a private military army. So they start blaming a general, specifically Lapin, for losing the Krasny Liman, how they call it, which is the Liman. We haven't seen this before. Usually propaganda, Putin and the people surrounding him, they are very unanimous in what they say, what they do. But we start seeing this. So do you think something is happening there, or this was a kind of punishment for Lapin?
I think it's possibly both. I'm more inclined at the moment to think that it's punishment for Lapin rather than any kind of significant cracks that are happening. We've seen comments from Kadyrov specifically from Kadyrov at least, about not wanting Chechen troops to be further engaged, and yet there hasn't really been the massive disengagement that you would have expected. How many of his troops are even left, I really don't know at this point. I think it's more of a punishment thing. There's a level of control that he still maintains. If we were seeing cracks, like genuine cracks, we'd be seeing them elsewhere too, which I don't think that we're really particularly seeing. I think there's been very focused, very directed comments that have come from certain segments, but it hasn't really gone any further than that. I would expect booking times on falling out of windows are probably freeing up soon, whether there's more poisonings, falling downstairs. I think that's sort of the next round. But they're very specific. I think if there were real cracks that were starting to appear, then they'd be more generalized as opposed to specifically targeted at people within the administration, within the Siloviki, who have sort of been responsible for any kind of a failure or perceived failure.
But do you think that the tension will be growing there? Because before there was a social contract between Putin and the people. So whatever Putin does doesn't really impact people. But that has changed, right? So whatever Putin does right now directly impacting people, the lives of the people surrounding them, their relatives, people who they know. Do you think it will, it's going to be the growing tension, especially after this mobilization? Because, we see directly that people saying that, you're just sending us to the meat grind.
Yes, but I think the timeframes that people are expecting this to happen on are not the same as what they're going to be in reality. From what I've gathered and from sort of comments that I've seen and discussions that I've participated in, people are sort of expecting things to happen well. They've mobilized, things are going to crumble quickly. Like people will rise up and those cracks will be magnified, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to happen that quickly. This is the process that can take months and possibly even years. Will it happen if things continue like this? Yes, it absolutely will. I mean, we've seen this in Russian history before. I mean, 1917, 1918 there's a lot of similarities in terms of sort of conditions that existed then. I'm not going to say that they're being replicated now, but there's parallels that can be drawn. But let's remember, those pressures took years and years to form and to finally foment into something big enough to overthrow the government. I think it can and will happen eventually if things continue like this, but it's not going to be in any kind of a short time scale.
Iran is giving lots of weapons and kamikaze drones to Russia. And I understand that the war is the great opportunity for everybody to test their weapons, and they are giving some long-range missiles to Russia. Why Iran wants to be part of this war and they get some extra sanctions possibly and be involved in this from the Russian side, which will never probably win?
I'm not an expert on Iranian sort of politics and conditions and whatnot, but I think Israel is probably a really big part of that answer. Israel has been very non-committal in terms of, coming in, for or against Russia, for or against Ukraine. But I think Iran's definitely looking at this as an opportunity to sort of drive wedges wherever it can. It's an opportunity for it to test out weaponry and technology and whatnot. I don't think they're particularly worried about extra sanctions, considering where they're at with the sanction regimes as it is. But anything that they can do to sort of further their own position across the region, Iran is a regional superpower. There's no doubt about that. And their biggest rival is certainly Israel, and anything that they can do to leverage against Israel, I think they're going to take that opportunity.
Okay. So at this rate, it doesn't seem that this war is going to be sustainable for Russia, because they do not produce enough to replenish all the military weapons and things like that. At the same time, Ukraine, getting lots of weapons support from the West. do you think that, how long this war may continue in your opinion?
I think if it was strictly a military conflict, a couple of years, as severe and as seemingly unsustainable as Russian losses have been, like the Russians are certainly switching to a more defensive posture. We're seeing anti-tank ditches and anti-tank lines. They're terrible, just terrible setups when you actually start looking and examining what they are. It's like, dollar store style anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth. But they're definitely seeming to take on a much more defensive posture. Defensive operations are far less costly in terms of resources. I think they could certainly look to be slowing down the Ukrainians. There's always the political factor and sort of an economic factor. How long can Russia last? I think Russia can still last an incredibly long time, provided that their manpower resources don't run out. This could go on for years. If the Russians can actually find a defensive line, stabilize it and maintain it, then it sort of falls down into almost, think of what happened in Korea in 1951. 1950, obviously there's the attack south, there's the Allied forces that go back north again, comes back down south. By about the summer of 1951, things had rather stabilized almost where they began, and it sat like that for 2 years with little pushes back and forth. That's a really possible outcome to this over the long term, provided the Ukrainians can keep Western support and the Russians don't completely collapse. I think that's a very possible outcome to this. There's a lot of ifs in there though. So,
and I have to ask, threat of the tactical nuclear weapons, is it still there? Or because in last forum in Valdai, Putin said that no, there's going to be no nuclear or nothing, but Biden said that the guy keeps talking about them. If there is no threat, why he keeps talking about it? So what do you think? Is it still the threat is imminent, or?
I haven't changed my mind. I think the threat is still present, but it's not real. Present but not realistic. Putin keeps mentioning it. He's going to keep mentioning it because it's the one significant card that he still really has to play that catches everybody's attention. Every time, Putin starts talking about nuclear weapons, whether he's going to use them or not going to use them, everyone starts talking about it. I see it on social media. I see it in the news headlines. As soon as the mention comes up, that's, it's drawing attention, and people start thinking and considering, well, okay, maybe what's the possibility of going to negotiations now? What's the possibility of giving some concessions somewhere? I still think it's bluffing. I still don't think that the Russians are in any position that they're going to use nuclear weapons. Like all of us, hopefully, hope to God that I'm correct in that assumption, but my opinion hasn't changed from the very beginning, that I don't think that the use of nuclear weapons is a realistic outcome as part of this conflict.
Okay, thank you, David. So I think we'll meet in 1 month to record another episode. So let's see how things change. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.